writing the arguments. Now, writing the arguments or arguments in general, students, that is the third important part of your paper. First being the introduction, the second being the literature review, third being the arguments. It is almost obvious that you write arguments to support your thesis statement. And your thesis statement, or alternatively, we use the word contention, is stated in your in the first part of your paper, ideally in the first paragraph. I did share with you an article by Ilka Sal, which had all these components in it. You know, there was a contention, there was literature review, and of course, there are arguments in that paper as well. You might like to read that paper more carefully, mainly because that is a literature paper. Okay, that will help you a lot in terms of keeping a model in your mind while writing your own paper. So let's begin with the primary question. What is an argument? Argument, of course, is a claim which has an evidence with it. So the contention you state in your paper, usually in the first paragraph of the paper, that is a claim that you make. But then that claim alone is not sufficient. You need to provide evidence to that claim as well. Now, your argument overall, therefore, is a combination of your claim and the evidence that you provide. So after the literature review part, you start providing your arguments to support your initial claim or your contention. While you write your argument, you need to understand that there is a range of complexity involved in the arguments that you present. Some arguments are pretty simple. Some arguments are much more complex. As a postgraduate writer, you should aspire for a little more complex argument. Of course, when you write a little more complex argument, that would also mean a little more complex language, which is fine. This is a place to experiment, okay, with your ideas as well as with your language. But of course, do not experiment with your argument risking the accuracy of your language. That, of course, is the primary concern. Now, if we take, say, a poet, W.B. Yeats, and we develop a claim about any of his poems, say The Second Coming, and our claim about the poem is that the poem presents the possibility of a new Messiah or the second Messiah. Now, this is one kind of argument. The other kind of argument is that the poem Second Coming gives a new vision of history. The second argument or claim that the poem The Second Coming gives a new vision of history Now, if you look at both of these contentions, the first contention that the poem presents to us the possibility of a new Messiah, that seems to be a little simple uh, contention, because the poem is precisely about that. The poem is precisely about the second coming. Even the title implies that. But when we say that the poem presents a new vision of history, that at once becomes complex. Why? Because this kind of contention is involving something beyond just the poem. One will have to look at the nature of history and then read the poem and tell or argue why this poem or how this poem presents a new vision of history. You will have to go into some of the researches in historiography, so to say, the structure of history, the nature of history. Now, for this second kind of claim, we need complex. So when you think of the arguments that you are going to write, of course, that the complexity of that argument depends on the kind of contention you have at the back of it. Okay, but to think of your arguments in terms of the complexity that they can take care of. And when you do that, it is possible when you start writing your arguments, you might have to revisit your initial contention. You might feel that this contention is too obvious and there is nothing to prove in it. It is kind of self-explanatory, or it is self-evident, and it doesn't require many arguments to be proven. Okay, if that is the case, for example, the poem is about Messiah, you might say a few words and then you are exhausted of the arguments and you have nothing else to say. Okay, not to talk about the complex arguments. So this is one thing that you need to take care while writing your arguments, that your arguments might direct you back to your initial contention and you might tend to revisit it or change it. So if your paper is not allowing for complex arguments, that means your contention needs to be revised one way or the other. Or other way around, if your contention is fairly complex, then you would be able to create complex arguments. Okay, now about the evidence. What is the evidence? The evidence is a proof that your claim is correct or your contention is correct. But the evidence that you produce, it must be proper to the claim that you make. Now, what do we mean by by being proper? Basically, this is a kind of disciplinary direction. For literature, the kind of evidence that you have to produce, it comes from a literary text. You have to provide citations, you have to provide phrases, you have to provide quotations, but you should move in a very calculated manner from claim to the evidence, and then another claim, and then another evidence. Like this, you will keep moving through the paragraphs. So each paragraph having one piece of proof or one piece of evidence along with the sub-contention. If you are able to produce, say, 5 to 6 paragraphs, that would mean you are able to produce 5 to 6 sub-contentions, and each sub-contention will have a piece of evidence with it. Of course, in literature, you cannot just present the evidence and done away with it. Rather, you are supposed to expand on that evidence. You need to explain that evidence, that how that evidence stands in support of the contention that you have. That we might call it explanation, or we might call it expanding the argument, but that is what you have to do in the case of each paragraph in which you are writing a sub-contention and an evidence for that. Also, here is something very important that I want to refer you to. I ask you to include roughly 5 resources in your literature review. I'm hoping that has made perfect sense to you. You don't have any question about that. But here is something additional that I want to tell you about those 5 resources. Please notice that those 5 resources that you have used for your literature review, they are going to stay with you for the rest of the paper as well. Once you have created the research context for yourself in the form of the literature review, and you have identified a gap in that literature review, and you are ready to now substantiate the contention that you made earlier in the initial paragraphs. From now onwards, in the arguments part, you are over and over again going to refer to those 5 authors you used in your literature review. Only then your evidence will be proper to the claim. Let me once again help you recall the analogy of the room. You know, researcher is a person sitting in a room with some other interlocutors, and they are all talking to each other. And you have your own position, and all of them have their own position. You are all arguing with each other. And you are the one who has her own arguments to support the contention that you have. Now, your arguments are meaningful only if you are responding to the arguments and counter arguments produced by the interlocutors sitting in the same room. Because otherwise you are not engaged in a conversation. You have to get engaged in a conversation with the people sitting in the room, having their own point of view about a particular object. Okay, students, so now those 5 resources that you have used in your argument, in your literature review, those 5 resources are going to stay with you. Now, here is what I'm suggesting to you. When you write the argument part of your paper and you have those 5 resources with you, it's not very hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, if not all those 5 of them, you can at least use 3 of them for the purpose that I'm just going to suggest to you. So in each argument that you write, one way or the other, make it possible for you to include the point of view of the author, whom you have already used in your literature review. But now you are going to use a substantial argument to kind of delegitimate the point of view of that author. In fact, the argument is the only opportunity. The argument part of your paper is the only place where you can establish your point of view to be more valid as compared to the point of view of the author whom you mentioned in your literature review, but over there you used him just to develop the context of your research And over there, you used him just to say this much, that these authors haven't given their point of view about the research, a point of view that you are going to explore. Okay, you previously used those authors just to create or identify the research gap. But now you are going to once again take them one by one. And with the help of argument and evidence, you are going to delegitimate them. Most probably, the evidence we are talking about, the evidence will come from your primary text. Okay, you can take your notes for these things. Your evidence is going to come from your primary text. Your primary text is going to help you support the contention that you have. But you are arguing against whom? You are arguing against those authors. To be systematic, take one author in one paragraph and then move to the second paragraph and take the second author in the second paragraph. There is no fixed order. It is your own order. You are kind of controller of your writing process. Okay, so I cannot really say which author should come first. But that is the strategy. Without this strategy, if the whole argument part, which is the most, which is the biggest part in your paper, it will stand out to be unresearched at its best. And that is what you have to avoid while writing the academic paper. You have to be engaged, continuously engaged in the conversation with those authors whom you are challenging. Now, it is possible that sometimes some of the authors might be partially in agreement what you are saying. If that is the case, you can just state that too. It's fine. But it will not happen in majority of the cases, because if most of the authors are already in agreement with what you are saying, then there is no point in writing this paper. So in your pre-research, you already have kind of established for yourself that your contention is going to be fairly unique. And most of the critics or writers or authors whom you found or whom you studied do not agree with the contention that you have. So your evidence should be therefore proper to the claim, but at the same time, as I said, that your arguments and evidence both, they should be in constant conversation with the other 4 or 5 authors whom you have mentioned in your literature review part. Any questions on this, students? Any questions about this?
Sir, it means we have to refer again and again the authors which we have discussed in literature review.
Yeah.
In the discussion part.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I understand your concern. Your concern probably could be, and some of others might also have the similar concern, that you did not find, so much literature which you put in literature review. Okay, it was not that much literature. So that is the nature of your paper. That doesn't matter. Okay, the kind of arguments that you will write will use just what you have. Just what you have. You have just 3 authors. That is fine. Just use them. Okay. They don't have in-depth analysis. Even then it is fine. Okay. You need to follow the structure of the paper. Okay. And this is how the structure is maintained. You have to be in conversation with the authors who have written on the same topic or on the same primary text on which you are writing.